Only 3 days in, and the week has already got its fair share of political headlines. A social care system in crisis, with possible council tax hikes, new challenges in the courts on Brexit, and we hear news of continuing conflict and suffering in Aleppo, as the ceasefire breaks down within 24 hours. We'll be covering these stories and much more. Welcome to Tip TV Politics. To chew over the week's news, I'm joined by Adam Barnett, Josh Lowe, and our wildcard this week is Paddy Baker. Guys, let's just start straight with PMQs. Who performed better this week? Let's start with you, Adam.
Well, it's always hard to decide who was the most impressive of the two of them. But I would say Jeremy Corbyn did a reasonably good job of holding Theresa May to account on the social care issue. He quite correctly said that when there are large tax giveaways for corporations in the form of a cut to corporation tax, it can't really be justified that local councils have to raise taxes on local constituents.
And he can smell weakness here, can't he, with Theresa May? She hasn't got a firm position on social care, or she hasn't. Well,
it seems like she didn't want to reveal it until later in the week. There's going to be an announcement from the Community Secretary. But as usual, she tried to bluff her way through the proceedings.
Josh, is Adam right that Corbyn is redeeming himself in PMQs?
Well, redeeming as a kind of continuous verb, I'm not so sure about. I don't know if he's consistently that good, but this was a strong week. I would compare it to his one on grammar schools a few weeks back. This is an issue that he cares about and the public care about, which is actually rare that those two things align. But you could see the genuine rage in his voice, and I think that clip of him saying, you know, fund social care now, please, I think that could make the evening news. So it's actually a rare hit for Corbyn, I would say.
Paddy, what about Theresa May? Did she do a decent enough job? Did she defend herself and her government well enough?
I mean, yeah, I think she did a relatively good job as such. I feel like in a way, I mean, sort of going on to what you guys were saying about Jeremy Corbyn doing a good job, my opinion was almost Jeremy Corbyn, he's not a very good speaker, and the way he sort of disguises it, as we saw today, was he got angry, you know, he puts on this good show. I mean, it is a matter he cares about. But again, what he was actually saying, there wasn't really much in it. It was basically, again, do something about social care, do something about social care. And I don't know, maybe it's me, but I just felt that a lot of the time she was sort of hiding behind this great emotional display rather than actually giving anything constructive.
And Theresa May did pounce on that, didn't she? She did say, what's Labour's position? And she did quote, I think, what a Labour minister, a shadow minister who'd said, we don't know when it came to social care funding. But so, Adam, you know, is Corbyn still in a bit of trouble with regards to his leadership?
I wouldn't have thought so. He's just won a re-election. But I don't actually agree with what's just been said. I think the government ought to have a policy and ought to be able to say how they're going to fund something as important as social care. And they shouldn't be able to just deflect and blame it on local councils, Labour run sometimes, as she tried to do, things like that.
So she didn't do a good job in your eyes. She didn't defend herself very well.
Well, she's not as good at blagging as David Cameron used to be, as avoiding questions. It's much more obvious when she does it. Which I think is a problem for people who watch these things. Most people don't, of course.
And Josh, is Corbyn getting better and better at this? Is he going to soon be the one dominating PMQs?
I think he's getting more professional, but also on this particular one, her other weakness was that their solution for it. They've announced some council tax rises. That's not a solution. That's not going to cover the crisis. So this was a very weak one for May. Let's wait and see if he's good against her when she's a little bit stronger. OK,
brilliant. Well, let's move on to the story of social care. This has been dominating the news this week, and the Times have been trailing a massive investigation on it for the past few days. Adam, give us just a roundup of what's been going on, just for the sake of the viewers.
General news?
General news on social care.
On social care, I beg your pardon. Well, there's been speculations, we've been saying that raison council tax might be the way to try and address this. And if so, it'll likely be announced tomorrow. As we've already said, it probably won't cover the costs. I mean, the local government authority reckons there's a £1.3 billion black hole in what they need versus what is available. Freedom of information requests have found that local authorities aren't spending what they need to, partly because they haven't got it. And it does come after 6 years of national government cuts to local government council funding.
And it's reported, Josh, that Theresa May blocked Philip Hammond from taking action on the issue to do with social care in the autumn statement, concerned about the impact and the political statement that we're having on her just about managing pitch. Is the fact that she's gone back on this now showing that she may be looking a bit decisive, or is it showing the scale of the problem in social care?
Well, it is. It's a huge problem, but I thought that was absolutely fascinating if that's true, because what that shows is that this group she's identified, the just about managing, are actually often not the group that's most in need. If you're just about managing, you are still managing, and it excludes the people who are not managing, which is surely the people that a government should really be stepping in to help. And this is an exact example of where those two groups come into conflict, and in the end, she's had to tip back away from the just abouts to the people who simply aren't coping.
And is she, let's just say, go to Paddy, is Theresa May showing strength here, or is she showing political weakness in her?
I mean, to be fair, I think both sides aren't showing any strength, simply because I think the problem is such that the whole system, I mean, almost what Jeremy Corbyn does say, says something needs to be done about social care. But from what I understand about what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do, is he wants to sort of go back to what it used to be like, i.e. central government, and then that falls to social care. However, it seems to me that when this infrastructure was put back in place back in the late 40s, early 50s, everything was slightly different. Society was different. People weren't living as long. And I think that generally, the whole question of social care does need looking at. And I feel like everybody's not going to... no one's going to perform to their strengths that well until they recognise that the whole system really does need overhauling, totally.
Well, that's an interesting point. Adam, is social care simply this problem that no party really has a credible solution for? And to be honest, in the past, in the 13 years of a Labour government, they never really had as well, particularly with an ageing population, rising.
Well, I'm not a supporter of any particular government or party. I would just say that if you're going to run a society, you should think what your priorities are and then provide the relevant money. If they can find money, billions and billions for defence contractors for things that don't work or don't turn up on time and so on, I'm pretty sure they can find a few extra million or billion for social care.
And what is it?
If they wanted to.
Josh, what does this say about the dynamic between Philip Hammond and Theresa May, this relationship between Chancellor and Prime Minister?
Well, it's once again, as we've seen with Brexit, a case of Philip Hammond just being, as they call him, spreadsheet Phil, just looking at the numbers and saying, no, we need this is what needs to happen. And Theresa May going, about the politics, and then eventually going, no, you're probably right, aren't you?
But is that a working relationship, do you think? Do you think they're doing well?
Well, I mean, it's less close than David Cameron and George Osborne. At the same time, maybe having a head and a heart in those two roles is not such a bad idea. Maybe it'll play out a bit better as they get to know one another a little bit better.
OK, well, let's move on to our second big story. And this is, of course, a story of what's going on in Syria. There's been a lot of news in the past 24 hours towards Aleppo, but then, of course, in Palmyra, where the ISIS have retaken the historic city back from the Russians. Josh, just give us the latest news on the ceasefire. Obviously, I've just said that the ceasefire has now collapsed, but just give us a bit more.
Yes, the ceasefire has broken down. I mean, it will, eventually it looks as though some kind of evacuation will happen, the city will fall. What we don't know is how many people are going to sadly lose their lives in the interim. We also don't know quite why it's broken down. It sounds like it's probably because the government started making demands about some of their men being released from other cities, and we don't know whether the rebels were happy or not to concede to that.
OK, and so do you see there as a possibility for a future ceasefire, or a future, because it was planned as a surrender, wasn't it? It was seen as a surrender from the rebels, that they will withdraw from the city. Am I right in thinking? It sounds
like the rebels have gone past the point of no return, and they will probably end up leaving the city and ceding it to the government. How many of them leave alive is the question that really remains.
OK, Paddy, from the debate yesterday, obviously there was an emergency debate in Westminster. Is the feeling, do you think, that not intervening in Syria, that Parliament has made a mistake, that they were thinking too much about the Iraq war when they were thinking about Syria?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in a way there is this sort of Iraqophobia aspect when it comes to foreign intervention, and rightly so in a lot of aspects because there was a lot wrong with the Iraq war, and that has definitely affected Syria. But as George Osborne said, and I think to his credit in a lot of ways, is he brought this up and basically said that non-intervention, this is the cost. Aleppo, the rise of ISIS is the cost of non-intervention. And yes, obviously, there needs to be ways in which we probably, in future years, when another conflict develops somewhere in the world, there will have to be a much more fixed and much more concrete criteria about what constitutes and what justifies foreign intervention.
Well, Boris Johnson, obviously the Foreign Secretary, said that the 2013 vote against the intervention or against any kind of lethal force in Syria by the British forces limited the UK's ability to intervene in the events of Syria, and therefore, as you've said about George Osborne, we perhaps have some kind of responsibility for what's been going on now. Adam, do you agree with that sentiment? Do you think that's correct?
Well, our government policy here and abroad has been, as I was writing in the newspaper yesterday, basically to ask Mr. Putin to ask Mr. Assad to stop killing people. I think this is a bad policy, even though it amazingly passes as conventional political wisdom. Of course, there's more we could have done. There's plenty we could have done. Again, if we're going to have all these weapons and all these resources and planes, but can't even drop food when people need it, it's a huge indictment and source of shame, I would say.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn came under fire. You've mentioned dropping food from Peter Tatchell, who's a sort of legendary campaigner, saying that Aleppo is today's Guernica. What's your understanding on Labour's position and Corbyn's position with regards to Syria?
There are divisions, as there are on a number of subjects in the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn, as a previous chair of the Stop the War Coalition, has a pretty decided opposition to any use of military force in other countries. I'd say that was a minority view in his party, as demonstrated in the vote on airstrikes against ISIS last December. However, the government, who holds more cards than a majority in Parliament, hasn't proposed a vote to drop any aid. Boris Johnson doesn't seem to be in favour of doing it. So I'd say that everyone ought to step up and get on with it, really. But it may be too late for the people of Aleppo.
Well, let's just move on to the other site in Syria, which made the headlines, Josh, which is the ISIS retaking of Palmyra. What does this show? How significant is this with regards to the fight against ISIS?
Well, it shows that ISIS are still a decent force, and it shows as soon as you take the pressure off them, they can get back. And what it shows in the longer term is that, sure, we could have done more in 2013 and intervened in Syria, but what would have happened after that? And if you look at Libya, where we did intervene, the death toll, civilian death toll, was lower, but at the same time, when the government fell, nothing took its place, and it's now a kind of failed state. And what the ISIS's strength shows in Syria is that if the government there had fallen, unless we had a solid plan for replacing it, there were plenty of forces who we don't like who could well have stepped in. So the truth is we don't really know what would have happened to Syria or what's going to happen to it in the coming months.
And Paddy, George Osborne made the point that Russia is becoming a more key player, power player in the Middle East. Do you agree with that? Do you think this really is going to be Russia taking advantage?
Russia's back garden as such.
Russia's back garden.
I mean, yes, exactly. What's happened ever since we've left Iraq, there's a power vacuum that's developed in the region. For probably over a century or so, Western powers have always been involved in this region, in these countries, and have helped to stabilise it. And not all, for good and bad, there's been lots of good and lots of bad that's come out of it. But what this means is that these countries have come to rely upon West intervention, have come to rely on the fact that if things get too tough, boots will be put on the ground. And now, ever since Iraq and Afghanistan, that's not happened. So this power vacuum has developed, and Russia, under a resurgent Mr. Putin, has basically seen it as a great and legitimate opportunity for it to sort of exercise and flex its muscles.
Okay, well, let's just talk about winner of the week. Who, for you guys, has been a real political winner from the week's events? So, Josh, let's start with you.
Mine would be Philip Davies, the MP for Shipley, who, despite being an anti-feminist, has been appointed to the Women's and Equality Committee. I mean, that's like an oil executive being appointed to the Climate Change Committee. You've got to applaud him. I personally don't agree with him, but you've got to applaud him anyway.
Adam?
You actually stole my winner. I was going to say Peter Tatchell for highlighting in the right sort of way the atrocities going on in Syria, and in particular putting the emphasis on the Assad government, which has killed the majority of the 500,000 people who've died there, rather than ISIS.
And Paddy?
As you probably guess, I'm probably going to have to go for George Osborne. Hasn't been around for a while, and I think his speech really sort of gives an idea about what's happened, and I feel has really given a good idea about why intervention is necessary.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Now, on to our In Focus. The dust may have settled from last week's Supreme Court hearing on Brexit, but if the government hoped last week would be the end to Brexit in the courtroom, they may be sorely disappointed. 2 new legal challenges against the government regarding Brexit were announced this week. Earlier, I spoke to 2 people leading one of them, Jonathan Liz, Deputy Director of the pro-single market think tank British Influence, and Leave Voting Adrian Yalland. We were joined via video call by Ben Harris-Quinney, Chairman of the Conservative think tank, the Bow Group, to look in focus at Brexit on trial. Jonathan Liz, this legal challenge originated through the British Influence think tank. Just talk me through the idea. What is the legal challenge about?
So the legal challenge centres on the EEA, the European Economic Area, which is comprised of the 28 EU member states, plus 3 non-EU member states, Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, who are in EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. So the challenge is that we don't leave the EEA automatically with Brexit, because we believe, independently contracting parties to the EEA, and if you want to leave the EEA, you have to trigger a separate withdrawal process, Article 127. Now that's important because the EEA is effectively the single market without agriculture and fisheries, and also without the customs union, for example, so you can enter into your own free trade agreements. It's the government's view that we leave the EEA at the same time as we leave the EU.
Well, it's not just the government's view, if I can interrupt you there, because there doesn't seem to be many people in Europe or in Britain who are really on your side with to do with this legal challenge. We've had Jean-Claude Pires, who's a former head of the European Council's legal service, who said that the UK's withdrawal from the EU will mean an automatic cessation of its membership of the EEA and as an EEA EU member. We've also had the government issuing a statement saying our position is clear, that the UK will be leaving the single market alongside leaving the European Union.
Well, the EEA.
The EEA, yeah. So what makes you think that you're going to be successful?
Well, I mean, they would say that, wouldn't they? Because it's convenient for them to take that attitude. Certainly for the European Union, they want to ensure that we leave the EEA automatically, because then that they retain that key bargaining chip in negotiations. We say that if you need to leave the EEA separately from the EU, in the negotiations, the pendulum switches from the EU to the UK, because the UK can't be forced out of the EEA, even if the EU wants them to be.
Ben Harris-Quinley, what do you make of this legal challenge?
Well, I think it's fundamentally unsound because of its motivations. And the same assessment goes for the recent challenge brought by Gina Miller. The point of these challenges, I think, are quite clearly, if you look at the people that are behind them, to vexate the diplomatic will of the British people. There are arguments that I think that can be made, particularly in the Gina Miller case, that are far wider than Brexit.
Well, let's just stay on this case right now.
Who is sovereign in the United Kingdom?
Okay, but let me just ask you this: what's wrong with making sure legally that the withdrawal from the European Union is completely watertight and isn't going to cause any problems down the road for Britain or the European Union with its relationship with Europe?
Well, I would feel far more comfortable if that is the question that is being asked. Why is it only people from the Remain camp that are involved in bringing this action before the court? Because surely that question affects us all.
Okay, well let's put that to Adrian Yelland. Let's put that to Adrian Yelland.
What concerns me is this case is being dominated by the Remain camp. It's being funded by the Remain camp, and I think for that reason there's a conflict of interest.
Okay, well let's put that to Adrian Yelland. Is it being dominated? Is this whole area being dominated by the Remain campaign, given that you voted to leave the European Union?
Well, I didn't just vote to leave the European Union. I've been campaigning to leave the European Union since 1992, when I fell out of love with the European Union, when it became the European Union after the Maastricht Treaty was forced through Parliament. So anyone that looks at my track record will know that I'm a very keen Brexiter.
And this isn't about in any way frustrating the progress of the government?
Absolutely not. This is about helping the government. This is about making sure that just as we're about to cross the line into Brexit, and I'm about to get back my country, and to see the success of a 25-year campaign, to see parliamentary sovereignty restored and legal supremacy restored to this great country.
Do you believe that the government
doesn't get tripped up?
Do you believe that the government has the mandate, the political mandate, to leave the European Union and the EEA?
No, I believe it has the mandate to leave the European Union, and it should leave the European Union. But I think that it does not have a legal mandate to leave the single market. And the reason that is the case is the point that Jean-Claude Pires raises, which is the issue of Article 126. Article 126 very clearly denotes the territories to which the agreement applies. However, it can be read the other way as saying that these are the territories to which it applies at the point of agreement.
But this is the man who's the former head of the European Council's legal service. He said...
He's not the Pope, he's still infallible.
But he's no doubt an area of high expertise.
He's not the ECJ. He's not the ECJ.
But he's not. But he is at the same time someone who carries a lot of expertise. And he said completely openly, this isn't going to work. This does not legally work.
It's a very persuasive opinion. It's the opinion that also underpins the government's position, which is the opinion that we're challenging. What I would ask Mr. Pires is, if you have your reading of the law based on Article 126, that when you leave the respective pillar of membership, be that EFTA or be that the European Union, what is the purpose of Article 127? Because Article 127 is very clear. If a member of this agreement wishes to leave the agreement, it must do so voluntarily by giving its notice. So there's no indication of automaticity in leaving the agreement upon leaving your respective pillar. So the point that he has to answer is, what's the purpose of Article 127?
Well, Ben Harris-Quinley, what do you make of what you've heard from Adrian there?
Well, I think what Adrian has just said is pretty extraordinary, because I actually happen to know Peter Wilding rather well. I've known him for almost 10 years. And Peter Wilding's organisation, British Influence, was described to me as being the heart of the Better Off In campaign. So to hear that apparently now it's staffed full of Brexiteers is very surprising. I think it'll be very surprising to most people in Westminster.
No.
I think most people, both in Westminster and in the country at large, will read this as what it is, as they have done with the Gina Miller case, which is an attempt, a funded attempt by people who want the United Kingdom to remain in the European Union, but failing that, have as soft a Brexit as they can possibly achieve. And its attempt to use their considerable financial resources to lobby the court.
Okay, well let's just bring
the will of the British people.
Okay,
which was
we've heard that, Ben. Let's just hear back from
referendum.
Adrian and Jonathan. If one of you, Jonathan, why don't you come in? Ben, let's just hear from Jonathan.
Look, we're not.
Ben, if we can, Ben, let's just hear from Jonathan, because we've heard your point.
Would be a vote to leave the single market. That is something.
Okay, we've got that. Let's just allow Jonathan
to
come back on.
If I can come in on that, if I can come in on that point as well.
I think that is really at the heart of this. It's what do the British people want?
Okay, we've got that point, Ben. We've got the point about the
and everything that goes with it, which absolutely includes the single market.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Well, Jonathan, why don't you come back?
First of all, we never claim the British Influence is stuffed full of Brexiteers. Clearly, British Influence.
Can I just talk actually about, on your website? I had a look. There's the idea of the smart Brexit, and I read something that remaining in the EEA is fully compatible with the Brexit referendum red lines of ending budget contributions to the EU and repatriating legal sovereignty and including the free movement of people. So am I right in thinking that we can stay a member of the EEA and still retain control of freedom of movement?
This is a very, very important point. The EEA honours the full freedoms. However, there is a precedent, there is more than one precedent, in fact, for certain leeway to be afforded the non-EU member states in the EEA. For example, Liechtenstein, under Protocol 15 of the EEA agreement, has a certain quota on the people who can work and settle in Liechtenstein.
If this is so obvious, why was this not very clear in the referendum campaigns? Why was it made so clear that, and I'm sure even Adrian, that you know that in the campaigning, a leave for the EU was commonly put alongside the end of the freedom of movement of people?
Well, some people said that, some people didn't. There were some people who were voting thinking that they were going to leave the single market, and there were others such as Dan Hannan, who was saying throughout the campaign that the Norway option, i.e. the EEA, was a perfectly valid transitional or long-term arrangement.
You have to be a member of either the EU or the EFTA.
When did they say that?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm talking about Jean-Claude Pires said that. In order to be a member, you'd have to be a member of the EFTA for Britain, for not being a member of the EU. And Norway has warned it could block any attempt by the UK to rejoin the EFTA.
Perhaps I could answer that question. Of course Norway can block our application to join EFTA. Doesn't mean that it will do, because if we join EFTA, we will treble its GDP. So that's the first question. Norway does have the right to block. Doesn't mean that it'll use it. Secondly, on the wider point, there are those qualifications that a state must meet in order to apply. And that's very clear. You have to be in EFTA or you have to be in the EU. Doesn't mean to say that they are the same qualifying conditions for a continued membership once you are in the agreement. Now, the point is that no one has yet managed to satisfactorily answer what is the purpose of Article 127. If an agreement between contracting parties, and Britain is a contracting party in its own right, has a very clear mechanism whereby a contracting party leaves the agreement, then begs the question, how can you have a degree of automaticity if you have an express term that says this is how you leave?
Ben Harris Quinney, Adrian puts forward a compelling case that we need to smooth out these legal complications, this legal grey area, if we're going to make a success of Brexit. And you don't think so at all?
No, that's absolutely not what I said. What I said was, I think if you look at this case and the Gina Miller case, my concern is that the people behind it and the people funding it are those who want Britain and wanted Britain to remain in the European Union. Now, what's interesting about the Gina Miller case is actually not about Brexit at all. It's about who is sovereign in the United Kingdom.
And Parliament is sovereign, and that's exactly what we're trying to establish.
And so actually, I think, these are important questions to ask. What concerns me, the people behind asking these questions.
He's now
The
said this
conflict of
3 times.
interest that exists, for example, with some of the funding, we know a lot of big Remain
Okay, Ben,
backers
we're
are
gonna have
funneling
to-
money
That's
to
not
these
true.
organisations.
That's not true.
People like Lord Sainsbury, for example, who is very keen to maintain free movement of people in order to ensure that he has, as he sees it, cheap labour for his
He
supermarket.
no longer
Right,
funds
okay.
a
So
penny in British
I
press.
think that we've got to acknowledge that the British justice system is not perfect. It does allow people with very deep pockets
Simply
to
not.
have a bigger say than your average
Simply not
citizen. And I think that that is wrong.
Okay.
And I think it needs to
Okay,
be
Ben, we're going to
explored.
have to.
And I think the motivations and the money behind these legal challenges have to be exposed.
Can we please?
Okay, can I very quick 10-second wrap up from you two?
Okay, Ben, let me put your mind at rest. British Influence is not funding this legal challenge. Myself and Peter Wilding are funding it, and then it will be crowd-funded. That's the first point. Secondly, my motivation is I believe in the rule of law, and I believe in parliamentary sovereignty. I've spent 25 years fighting to get the British courts to be sovereign over this territory and to get Parliament to be sovereign over our legislature. I'm not going to allow that to be steamrolled or wasted or thrown away at the last minute by a government that's got the law wrong.
Look,
Okay, right. We're gonna have to leave it there because you've run out of time. But thank you very much, Jonathan Liss from British Influence, Adrian Yalland, and Ben Harris-Quinney, chairman of the Conservative think tank, the Bow Group. Well, joining us in the studio now is Hugh Bennett, deputy editor at Brexit Central. And Hugh, if we just start with you, are these court cases really about suppressing the will of the people or suppressing the democratic process?
Well, I think there is a real danger here that, we've had the vote to leave. It's been almost 6 months now. And when you look at it, actually, most people, Leavers and Remainers, almost 70% of people, are simply saying, whichever way we voted, we accept the result. We just want the government to get on with delivering Brexit. And they see sort of court case after court case coming along, and they're really thinking, what actually is this about? I think Gina Miller, who brought the case which was in the Supreme Court last week, said, this isn't about politics, this is about process. Well, I'm not sure voters and people out there really buy that argument. I think.
Okay.
A lot of them, yeah.
Adam, do you agree with that?
Well, I'd just be fascinated to know how you know what most people think about these court cases. I'm not aware of any measure that we can reliably use. Pro-Brexit people like to say that polls are usually wrong, so we probably won't point to it. I think people in a free society have a right to pursue things through the courts. Why not? What's the downside? If they're confident of their case, they'll win.
Josh?
Well, I think we know what 48% of the public think, which is that they wanted to stay in the EU, and we know what 52% of the public think, which is that they didn't. And to my mind, that's always a very close vote. It's talked about as if it's not, but it is. And so I think having a bit of fair scrutiny about the process and about the time, and maybe an opportunity to delay and let people have another think is not unreasonable given the way the politics laid out. If it was 65, 35, I'd be saying fine, leave it.
Okay. Well, let's now go on to our Brexit explainer. This week we're looking at the transitional deal. Hugh, if you just give us a roundup of what's happening with all this talk of a Brexit transitional deal this week.
Yeah, so earlier this week we had the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, talking about sort of so-called transitional deal. And I think it's not entirely clear what this would involve, but essentially it's the idea that if we can't get a comprehensive deal wrapped up in the 2-year Article 50 process, there'd be some sort of deal which would see some of the existing arrangements carry on after 2 years. And of course, this has caused consternation amongst a number of Leavers because they worry that this basically a temporary deal, a transitional deal, may well end up becoming a permanent deal, and yet we won't end up leaving the EU after all.
I mean, just how significant is that sentiment, that real suspicion of this notion of a transitional deal really just elongating the Brexit process to a point where everyone just gives up and, we're not leaving the EU anymore? Is that really genuine in Whitehall?
Well, I think Philip Hammond is seen as probably the most resistant to Brexit of the major cabinet figures. On the other side, you have people, obviously David Davis is sort of stuck in the middle, the Brexit secretary himself. He's sort of neither ruled anything out nor ruled anything in. You get reports one day saying one thing, saying the other. But I think from Theresa May's point of view, she's got to go to the voters by 2020 in a general election. It'll have been 4 years since the vote to leave. If at that stage we're still under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, we still don't have any way to control free movement of people. I think the voters are going to think, what's going on here? And I think there's actually quite a strong political imperative for, if there is a transitional deal, it must be, very limited to certain sectors. It can't simply be perpetuating the EU membership.
Yeah. Josh, do you agree? Should this transitional deal be limited?
Well, I think that what David Davis said today in the Brexit Select Committee was to do with it being, we could have a transitional deal as long as it's sort of towards something. So we know basically where we're going, but we need a bit of extra time to get there. That doesn't seem entirely unreasonable. From the EU side, I feel like they might like something a little bit longer, but we'll wait and see how it pans out. But David Davis's position doesn't seem too crazy.
Well, the European Parliament's chief Brexit negotiator, I would try and pronounce his name, but I know I'd fail.
Verhofstadt, yeah.
As you said, said that he's open to a transitional arrangement, but he said also that it should have a strict time limit this week. Adam, what do you think of this? Do you think a transitional deal is the right deal for Britain?
Well, any deal at this point is one of damage limitation, and the ministers seem to know that, the less fanatical ones of them. So a transitional deal would be preferable to no deal at all.
Okay, and let's just talk about Labour, because Labour's position on Brexit has come under some criticism in the sense that the voter on the door doesn't really know what their position is. What do we know from this week from Keir Starmer's speech on Labour's stance on Brexit?
Well, Labour's public position, the one they unified on, is that they've accepted the result of the referendum and want to ensure that the Tories don't run Brexit the way they've run the country. In other words, that they safeguard people's rights and everyone has, that the economic damage is at least evenly spread.
Is that how are they going to get that through to voters in a sort of crisp, because obviously the Lib Dems are against Brexit, the Conservatives are for making Brexit happen. Where is Labour going to slot in, do you think?
It's difficult. I wouldn't want to be the one advising them on how to do it. But I think they did pull off a reasonably good scrutiny measure last week with the motion on having the plan published. Though we've just learnt from David Davis that we might not hear what it is until February, which is extraordinary. Another example of the incredible contempt the man has from the public.
Indeed. Well, Hugh, the Labour Party, is it under real trouble with regards to Brexit and not having a defined position with regards to perhaps losing support to the Lib Dems on the issue?
Well, I think Labour is really in a bit of a pickle over this. I mean, you had Keir Starmer saying, basically, we accept there have to be limitations on free movement of people. We want the best possible access to the single market that we can secure. That's basically the government's position. You know, they're not really distinguishing themselves from Theresa May in that regard. Then you have someone like Diane Abbott, Shadow Home Secretary, saying, no, we don't want any restrictions on free movement of people. I think that's really not going to be a very popular position amongst voters outside metropolitan boroughs in London. And so I think the public really, they don't know what to think. You know, you had 3 Labour shadow cabinet front benchers voting against a Labour motion last week. You know, the fact that that wasn't even reported as big news shows, I think, you know, Labour really don't have a clear position, and unfortunately for them, you know, that's how it comes across to the public. The public don't know what Labour thinks on Brexit, and I think Labour could be in trouble as a result.
Josh, what's the mood in Europe towards Brexit? Do they still maintain that they want to make it hard for Britain? It needs to be a difficult Brexit in order to ensure that the European Union stays united afterwards?
I think one of the key things to say about the mood in Europe is that Brexit is not their biggest problem. In Europe, it's migration, it's Russia, it's Poland and what's going on there. There are so many things they care about other than us. So the punishment thing, I think, plays into that in the sense that if they can kind of get us gone, make it look a little bit nasty for us, then they can sort of move on with this whole business of referendums and get back to dealing with the problems they actually care about. So they're a little bit annoyed at the moment, I would say, and not particularly that, it's not top of their agenda.
And you can find clips of this show and much more on our social media pages and on our website, tiptv.co.uk. Thank you very much to my sofa, Adam Barnett, Josh Lowe, Hugh Bennett and Paddy Baker, and to my guests, Jonathan Liss, Adrian Yalland and Ben Harris-Quinney. Until next time, have a great week.